right, good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome. My name is Weinrach, and I'm the programming officer here at Toronto Public Library. I look after the A-List Author Series, cultural programming, and special events for TPL. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the Toronto Reference Library is located on the lands held in treaty by the Mississaugas of the First Credit Nation. I would also like to take this opportunity to remind and reaffirm as Torontonians our treaty responsibilities to the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the treaty holders of these lands, collectively referred to as the Toronto Purchase, which span the area west to Brown's Line, east to Woodbine Avenue, and north to Newmarket, and south to the shore of Lake Ontario. It is through this treaty with the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation that we are able to live, work, and play in Toronto, and to call this great city our home. This land is also part of the Dish with One Spoon territory, a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee to peaceably share and care for this land and its resources. All those who come to live on this land are invited to do so in a spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Tonight's program, a tribute to the late, great Leonard Cohen, is part of the library's A-List Writer Talk series, which brings notable Canadians, authors, journalists, poets, and new faces to branches across the city. It's a chance for Torontonians to enjoy conversations on Canadian literature and culture, and meet their favorite writers. This series would not be possible without the support of the Canada Council for the Arts, which we are very grateful. Here at the Reference Library, I invite you to come to some of our upcoming programs, including award-winning author Helen Humphreys on her new book, The Ghost Orchard, and that's on Monday, November 20th, and acclaimed writer Nick Mount on The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly of CanLit, and his latest book, Arrival, with award-winning journalist Elaine Dwar on her new book, which was a finalist for this year's Governor General Award, The Handover, and that's on Monday, December 4th. Also appearing are Kyle McClear, David Walter Taves, Roz Ney, Robin Harding, and Alison Pick, and a full listing can be found online at tpl.ca/alist, A spelled EH, for Canadian name. All right, tonight we celebrate a Canadian legend, someone who significantly shaped our culture, music, and literature. I must confess, growing up, I was not a fan. My parents would play his CDs on repeat at home and in the car, where my brother and I would sit on what seemed like endless road trips, and that's what we would listen to, which to us came across as a small amount of torture. However, I'm older and wiser, and with my parents not being here tonight, I am happy and freely admit that I now have a newfound appreciation for his music and his contribution to our country and to our art forms. I'm super happy and delighted that Honey pitched this idea to me, and I always come to these events, I say I never think that anyone's going to show up, and there's so many people here, which is such a tribute to the man's great work. So, without further ado, I'd like to speak about our host this evening. Honey Novick lives in Toronto, Canada. She is a singer, songwriter, voice teacher, and poet. She's a full member of the League of Canadian Poets, the Ontario Poetry Society, and SOCAN. She was mentored by Irving Layton, Duke Redbird, Charles Jordan, Abby Lincoln, and many others. She is the author of 8 poetry books and CDs, including the recent book, Stanguin Encounters with Greatness, and the CD Martinuk, Acorn, and the Free Speech Movement. She is the recipient of many awards and honors, including the 2014 Empowered Poets Award, World Poetry Society, the 2010 winner of the Bobby, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced this, the Bobby Vigabao Memorial Award. Thank you. Please give a warm welcome to Honey Novick.
Hi, everybody. Am I turned on?
Just gotta flip it on.
Turn me on, Sarah. Am I audible now? Okay. So for those of you who know me, I really want to thank you so very much for coming out and celebrating this important. Well, okay, Jim. For those that don't know me, I hope that won't last very long, because I'm going to do my best to use this opportunity to tell you not only how Leonard influenced me, but also, as much as I can, as to how this was created. So I have the good fortune to sing from time to time with the inimitable George Eliot Clark, Canada's current poet laureate. And so we were here last year doing the Austin Clark event, I think it was, and we talked about it. Anyway, to make a long story short, he suggested that I talk to Sarah, so I did. Then came, and with her blessing, we created a date and time. And then came the hardship. I'm sure most of you who are parents know naming something is not always easy. So I delved into Jewish tradition, and on the year anniversary of a person's passing, we call it Yortzeit, a year's time. And coincidentally, this was as close as we could get to Leonard's actual Yortzeit, which was 2 days ago. So thus, and for the Yortzeit, traditionally, we light a 24-hour candle. I actually bought one and then left it at home because I didn't think that we could light a candle and not blow it out in the library, and I wouldn't do that. Anyway, thus came about a candle for Leonard. With Sarah's help, really, the wonderful Denise Donlan signed on, easy peasy. And then came a list that I submitted to George for approval. So with his blessing, we will welcome John B. Lee, who was Poet Laureate in Perpetuity of Brantford, instead of Rank, right? Okay, good, because I don't always get it right. So now, without overstaying my welcome, I just wanted to tell you that my piece, entitled Madly, I'm Your Fan, a personal letter to Leonard Cohen, was first performed, debuted at the Mad Pride Festival in July, and then was re-performed at the Sokagakai, the Society for the Creation of Values Educators Conference, and they gave me a standing ovation. I'm not telling you I'm looking forward to it, I'm just telling you. But just in case. Okay, so this has been culled from a half an hour. This is an open love letter to Leonard Cohen. Lenny, madly, I am your fan. Madly, I'm your fan. Lovingly, adoringly, not wanting to exaggerate yet. Madly, I am your fan. Poetically, prosaically, respectfully, and why not? You who gave so much to so many, you whose words gave so much to so many, why shouldn't I be one of the recipients and in turn a fan? Your words even now say so much. Quote, to keep our hearts open is probably the most urgent responsibility you have as you get older, unquote, Leonard Cohen. And with this open, heavy heart, knowing that your suffering is transformed to a new, unknowable realm, I sing for you and worship you, for you gave a very young woman hope. Songs of Leonard Cohen was your first LP. I saw your photo. I was 19 years old, and I fell in love. You were a Jewish poet, a young Canadian Jewish poet. I came from a traditional Jewish home, groomed to attract a nice boy, a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher. That expectation was my mother's, not mine. I was ripe for the pickings, ready to be plucked, even though I preferred to do the picking and the plucking. Yet, for one so cloistered and protected, this rebel heart awoke in your words, and then I saw you on TV and felt hopeless. You were funny and smart and had a champion in Irving Layton. You had a look that was confident, sophisticated. I only had youth. And then I read your graffiti. Come find me, I'm almost 30. At 19, I was floored. What? If you were 30 and still looking to be found, and I was 19 with 11 years to contemplate, what hope did I have to be found? I had to stop thinking about that. I learned to see Marianne and Suzanne. I ate oranges and drank tea. I learned to shop at Salvation Army counters and went to Montreal. After several years of going to Montreal, I decided to go to you. I found out your address, went there, knocked on the door, and someone answered saying, Leonard isn't here. Then gave me the address in New York. I wrote to you. You wrote back. Oh, be still my heart. I still cherish that piece of paper and the envelope in which it came. It's on display. During this time, my closeted period of wannabiness, I wrote. I wrote by light of the tides of the moon. I wrote when I could be private, in the General Idea studio when all were asleep. I wrote and imagined and then hid those thoughts in a file folder until one day I learned Irving Layton was poet in residence at York University. Mustering my courage, I called his office and made an appointment. Rather than take the work to him, he insisted on coming to my home. Irving Layton, Leonard's great champion, took the file folder, read each page in silence, then stood, closing the folder, dramatically pronounced, "My dear, those aren't poems, those are songs." Putting the folder down on the table, promptly left, leaving me devastated. No discussion, no words of encouragement or analysis. I put the folder back in the closet, literally, and left it there for many years, begging the question, where does poetry end and lyrics begin? Or where does lyrics end and poetry begin? In those many years, I did become a songwriter, singer, voice teacher, and eventually a poet. One day, on an estate in New Brunswick, I heard on the stereo a gravelly voice singing, "I'm your man," and laughed out loud. I was grieving my mother's passing, far from all that was familiar. And here comes this voice and makes me laugh. I bought a Leonard CD and then heard, like a blessing come from heaven. For something like a second, I was healed and my heart was at ease. Driving from New York back to Ontario, I looped that song and played it for the duration of the drive. For a blessing, like a blessing come from heaven. For something like a second, I was healed and my heart was at ease. While working on liner notes for a CD of Yiddish music, I included that quote in the liner notes booklet. By then, I learned Leonard was into Buddhism. When I heard him speak of it, he was very encouraging. I too became a Buddhist, a Nichiren Buddhist, chanting the invocation Nam Myoho Renge Kyo. It is a different teaching than the one Leonard was into. Nichiren Buddhism has one rule only, the diamond principle. Once you start chanting, don't stop. The Buddhism Leonard embraced was too disciplined for me, waking at 5 a.m. and being silent. But the similarity in seeking enlightenment, and thus his influence, the permission, unmistakable. Educator Josei Toda declared, enlightenment is not acquired, it is recollected. In the early part of this new century, the country of Canada's literati types were going to celebrate the life, work, and joie de vivre of Irving Layton as he faced life in his 80s. I read in the Toronto Jewish newspaper of this and applied to write a tribute song. Thus, I wrote, Ben Shmonim Legevura Irving. It's Hebrew and translates as, son of 80 years, have health and strength. It's a jaunty number. That song was accepted and I was off to Montreal's Centaur Theatre. We all were warned not to expect you, Leonard. It hadn't occurred to me, but once the seed was planted, I thought, maybe, just maybe I could see you. And thus it came to be that I performed Bench 1 in Likavua, Irving. Lo, after all these years, Irving, frail, still with a glint of joie de vivre, gave me a standing ovation. Seated near, but not with, was you, Leonard, and I found it hard to breathe. I was in the same room with Leonard, who I personally think of as God, but would never say so to his face. I had to keep my adorations and respect in tow, and I did. After the party, Leonard was taking requests for photos with one and all. I asked if I too could be in the picture. Sometimes dreams really do come true. With a cigarette in one hand and me in the other, it's over there, he posed. And I pressed both palms together and bowed. He pressed both palms together and bowed. I bowed lower. He bowed lower still. I bowed lower still. He bowed lower still. And then when I felt the floor close to the peak of my head, I stood. As did you, wonderful Leonard, or Lenny, as your friends from summer camp call you, and we both laughed and parted. I sent you copies of all the photos taken that day with my camera. I found you at the Buddhist monastery in Mont Baldy, California, and sent them. You replied and thanked me for my kindness. It is written by your hand in ink and framed with an envelope over my piano. It's not here. When I get sad or discouraged, I take out my laminated photo, one in each bag and on every wall, and remind myself that sometimes dreams really do come true. In the ensuing years, much was made of your private life that never held interest for me, other than your help and words of wisdom. I bought your CDs over the years and read your interviews, and then it came, the sad inevitable. It was a time of ineffable, unspeakable loss. First, the United States was lost to a cruel, mean-spirited, woman-hating, race-baiting, sadistic person, and then 2 days later, news of your passing. It was interesting that you passed just before the USA elections, and word was kept until after we knew that the world drastically changed. For months, I didn't want to hear your final CD. You wanted darker, and then I did. You intoned, "Here I am, Lord." All the melodies of the synagogues came alive in your prayers. The beseeching, the resilient determination, the staunch conviction. Here I am, the suffering, endurance, pleas, joys, all from the depths of your life. And then I wrote, on this Remembrance Day, Veterans Day 2016, the one thing I will not be able to say about Leonard is, lest we forget. We had Leonard for a long time. I think he was ready to go. He said so. We all will travel one day, and when that time comes, I hope I will be ready. I will sing for Leonard poems, songs, the Kaddish. I will light incense and chant. I will say prayers of gratitude. I will look at the photo of him and me in Montreal celebrating the life of Irving Layton. Yes, these are sad days. It is up to each one of us to be resilient, to become resilient. And we must one day say, I awoke. I awoke, I am really pumped and stoked. Fires of the heart, leaves of art, a new day born. No time to feel tired and worn. Lovers of life will not be forlorn. Leonard said to Irving on his 80th birthday in Yiddish, Bis 120, may you live to be 120. It didn't happen to Irving, and now not Leonard. Now is the time that we sing and write for Leonard. Like a bird on a wire. Please sing with me. It won't be the same as his. Like a drum in a midnight choir. I have tried in my way to be free. Like a word on a walk. Like a night from some old-fashioned ends for me. If I have been unkind, I hope you can let it go by. If I have been untrue, I hope you know it was never to you. Like a baby stillborn, like a beast with his horn, I have torn everyone who reached out for me. But I swear by this song and by all that I have done wrong, I will make it all up to thee. I saw a beggar leaning on a wooden crutch. He said to me, "You must not ask for so much." And a pretty woman leaning on her darkened door, she cried to me, "Why not ask for more?" Like a bird on a wire, like a drum in a midnight choir, I have tried in my way to be free. Thank you so much for listening to me. It really is my honor to introduce to you John B. Lee. As I said earlier, John B. is Poet Laureate of Brantford in perpetuity. And there's a lot I would like to say, but he handed me his bio. So in 2005, John B. Lee was inducted as Poet Laureate of Brantford in perpetuity. In 2007, he was made a member of the Chancellor's Circle of the President's Club of Master University and named first recipient of the Sowesto Award for his contribution to literature in his home region of southwestern Ontario. 2011, appointed Poet Laureate of Norfolk County. 2015, Honorary Poet Laureate of Norfolk County for life. Winner of the $10,000 CBC Literary Award for Poetry. The only two-time recipient of the People's Poetry Award and a 2006 winner of the inaugural Sylvester Writing Award. I can go on. I don't want to, John. But I do want to say this, that I'm one of the people whose life has been enriched by John. He wrote an amazing book asking Canadian writers to contribute something regarding the Beatles. He's a maven and an expert. He also encouraged me to write about my roots. I called them, "It Takes a Willow to Grow a Geranium," and it won this year's Ontario Poetry Society's honorable mention. Anyway, so you heard all his accomplishments. You've heard me lauding him. I think now it's my turn to shut up and to welcome the really inimitable John B. Lee.
Inevitable.
Inimitable.
Well, Montreal. I grew up deep in southwestern Ontario, a farm boy, and Montreal was an exotic place. My introduction to two of my three favorite poets, Dylan Thomas has always been the poet that made me want to write, and Fern Hill was one of the first poems that I realized, well, you could write about a farm. You could write from the point of view of a farm child. But all of us, back in 1968, when I was in grade 12, all of us purchased a copy of Leonard Cohen's selected poems. That book of poems that sold 250,000 copies. So that's only 249,500 more than most of us sell. And my grade 12 and 13 English teacher posted a poem, a little tiny poem at the back of the room. And it was a poem by Leonard Cohen. And it was 3 simple lines. And it was incredibly important to read those 3 lines. Marita, please find me. I'm almost 30. And why it was important to me was that it may have been the first poem that I actually memorized. And then a few years later, Cohen wrote a book called The Energy of Slaves, which had a poem in it that I've remembered ever since. It's only a 2-line poem. They locked up a man who wanted to rule the world. They locked up the wrong man. That incredibly, that sense of irony and pithiness came across for me in that poem. The third poet that I discovered in my high school library was the collected poems of Irving Layton. And I signed that book out and took it home and read it a number of times, and the librarian kept congratulating me on reading that book, which proves to me that librarians don't read. Because that book is filled with the kind of hearkening back to a poet that influenced Layton, and that is Catullus. And one of the things that I celebrate about these poets like Layton and Purdy and Cohen is that for many of us, many young contemporary poets, you could throw a party for all of their influences and everyone could come. And the thing that I loved about these poets is they, especially in the case of Layton, he reminded me that poetry is a very, very old art. He saw himself as a prophet, and he was something of a mentor to Leonard Cohen. My friend Marty Gervais told me that he went to a poetry reading by Leonard Cohen, and Cohen apologized to everybody. He said, I'm going to indulge myself. Please forgive me. And he went and sat down and took out his guitar and took out a piece of crumpled up paper and smoothed it out, and for the first time sang the song Suzanne. Many of us in this room, unlike the person who introduced the evening, did have a long journey with Leonard and have liked him for a very long while. So, the day that he died, I wrote a poem which doesn't mention him, but it is actually an elegy for Leonard Cohen. I live on the lake. I looked at the water washing in and saw the beautiful colors of the lake with bands of sand that you can see through the translucent water, transparent water. And I realized that I was looking at things beyond the last sandbar, which seemed to me to be a good phrase for where we go when we go into the deepness, into the depth. Beyond the last sandbar. Beyond the last sandbar, a small regatta of gulls float at rest, and they are shell white, drifting in a barely seeable circle of windless motion, each gull like a nun's cornet, if a nun were a doll and a doll were drowned, riding the slow in-breath of resting water, rising and falling to follow old rhythms of a sleepy measure in calm dreaming, without foam, where the sky had fallen like the lassitude of blue silk settling, drawn on a loom at the hem with the delicate tugging of a hand-sure thread. And there, to the east, a great black armada of Canada geese, wild waterfowl, blinking their webbed feet, coming in and going thence to groom the beach with the drop shadow of their reflection like ash on water, washing away the fire, built over close to the finality of waves in the hissing of dampening heat that flares up and is banked for the last burning. Overhead, a kettle of vultures catch thermals along the black drag of a ragged coast. As a sudden hawk glides through worried by crows, chased by that caw going west to the general rumor of awe. What is it then, I wonder, to live in the wind? What is it to be born in the rough nest of the eyrie like a storm-broken orchard, the oriole's pouch, the martin's motel, to thrive in the swamp or live on the high ledge overlooking the city? I've seen those chevrons pulling the dark remainder of the day as it cools and they go quickening home to the close-at-hand shallows of gloom. It is sweet to remember and lovely to know how the forest forgets and the forest recalls as we enter the earth like the rain. And 2 nights ago, when people were celebrating in Montreal, I was driving home, and one of those optic illusion moons was in the sky. A November moon, not a harvest moon, not a big orange full moon, but a half-broken moon close to the horizon, looking absolutely grand and twice the size of the moon, as though it were inflated. And it was the night of the second candle, the night that we experienced a year since the passing of Leonard. So I bring you this poem called November Moon. Last night, the moon's illusion shone as a luminous stone floating over the leafless treetops of this autumn town. A frosted rock hovering on the close horizon of her mother, the earth. As though in lost ellipsis of ghostly desire she were drawn down for a life-proving breath of water-borrowed light that loomed for a silvery moment in a mirror of false compare. Save your hands. George L.A. Clark chose this poem to be featured this month on the Canadian Poets website, and it's called On Kindness. Leonard had an interesting, lifelong, affectionate relationship with his mother. I had a very similar relationship with my mother, and I had a mixed relationship with my father. Sons and fathers are sometimes difficult. It's a difficult relationship. My father ended up being one of my biggest fans, and anyway, this poem is called On Kindness, and it's on the Poet Laureate website. Write the word love on one side of a single sheet of white bonded paper, and then write the word hate on a second. Let each leaf drift loose from the same height at exactly the same moment, keeping in mind the scholar's parable of a pound of feathers. And even given the drop weight of heavy words, you notice a sameness as they fall through the invisible calipers of time, all the while wondering at the value of loft and the measure of ink, knowing how the wet wing tips in flight to almost touch the rising wave, or the shadow spreads in the brilliant gloom of its own reflected worth, subsiding to soft gray in a second light with a different source, as it is with the lucent green of filmy water gulping a plunging stone, disappearing beneath the echo rhythms of a radiant O. Think here of the human heart, how it daps on the wrist, then vanishes like a pinch in silk. Say your father enters the story, and you are a boy at his table, having trimmed the fat and left it oiling the plate at the close of the meal. And there it lay in white refusal, a greasy remnant of your appetite. And he says, "You shall not leave this table until you have finished every scrap." And you lay your fork aside, cross your arms, and concentrate on the cut lines of the gristle and the marbling of slivered meat. Meanwhile, the shine congeals as it cools and scums the surface, and you wonder why he insists. You know you will not comply. You will stay forever if need be. What do you care for love or hate? And then your grandfather enters the story on a different day. He places his hand on your wrist, catching his breath as you climb together what for him is a difficult hill. And you want your father to know how slowly you walked, how full of care, how light his hand like a breeze in the hair, how labored his breathing, how heavy his old heart, a stone beating in the breast like the sorrowful drumming of black cloth. And the words land light, and the words land hard. And love lifts as it falls, and hate falls as it lifts. And the two together play like the mating of gulls. And you are still at the table, and you will remain forever halfway up the hill with the hand weight of a ghost you must carry as a great tree carries the shade. And I'd like to finish with a poem I couldn't have imagined as a boy when I read a tourist in Cuba turns his thoughts home, that I would go to Cuba and make friends in Cuba, translate Cuban poetry into English, and return to Cuba 15 or 20 times. And this poem is a lest we forget poem, because I think we need to be vigilant, ever vigilant, about what Neil Young calls waging peace. And it was a poem that I wrote on San Juan Hill, a famous battle site in Cuba that Americans remember as the Teddy Roosevelt moment in American history. And we asked our Cuban friends about Teddy Roosevelt, and they said, "Who's that?" Anyway, this poem I'll finish with. It's called "A Contemplation Had on San Juan Hill." And I read it because we're very close to Remembrance Day. Lest we forget, and never again, are the two phrases that come to my mind when we commemorate the sacrifice made by those young people who lost their lives and gave their lives in all countries. A contemplation had on San Juan Hill. 3 men of peace stand talking of love and the shadow of the soul and the healing power of prayer beside the long cannon aimed at the flowering shrubs that line the road of San Juan Hill in Santiago. And the muzzle is an open O, a black vowel stinking of ash where some tourist stood tapping the tip of his smoldering cigar as if, with the withering away of the burning voice of Cuba, it were lost like candle snuff from the ancient, nearly sacred mythology of war. What was once an American island in a sea of slaves, a mob or mobster's paradise, a playground for the wealthy few, is now quiet in the heat and the beautiful light of the day, redolent of the scorched silence of a stubbed flame of a tobaccinated word. at the burning end of a smoker's conversation. This being the ghost perfume in the sound blast of a quiet salutation, a wind-hollowed lament of what we believe of was. Who lights the absent fuse? Who touches fire to the old and only recently artillerated dawn, lays siege on bougainvillea and sweet white and only slightly fragrant yucca blossoms, and blue-green agaves of the spirit as the sun arcs round the brilliant shoulders of the man who wants a better world. And he says he prays for the sad and often discouraged son. He prays for a greater share of the meager supper of the poor. He prays for others, for the lonesome widow living alone too long. He walks in the blue-veiled light where heaven blushed like lamp silk tossed over those of us who see the purpose of a living spirit, those of us for whom the red heart embers in the breast like borrowed fire, those of us longing to know that what hungers at the soul mouth also blesses these stones, these footsteps. And the clattering hooves of history, this president, this disappointed general, all disillusioned poets, nameless heroes, grieving mothers, sorrowful wives, weeping children, orphaned by guns' result, and the buried hope of generations, every woeful stranger gripping a flag as he fell like the rain that goes on greening the grave. These footsteps drum up love. This soul says love. This body sings love. These hands work love. This breath breathes love. And what the dust learns, the dust also teaches. We are ancestored by such great lessons. The earth prays with one grand hallelujah, one simple and ineluctable supplication that we praise love. Thank you.
I hope you feel as I do that listening to John read, your life becomes enriched. Thank you again, John. So we started this last March, and in the process you go through many, many things. It's like sculpting. So one of the things that we went through, mainly Sarah and I, is that I got this brainwave to invite Malka Himel to be part of this evening. For those of you of a certain generation, you may remember the folk singing duo of Malka and Joso. And my dad's Malka. And for many reasons, she was not able to come. She did say to me to tell Sarah, so I'm going to tell you. She said, tell Sarah that we should do this again next year and we'll call it Another Candle. We'll let her know. Anyway, Sarah had already introduced herself to you, and she is going to read Malka's contribution about her friendship with Leonard. And I'm very happy that Sarah's graciously agreed to do this.
Hi again. So this is not something that I typically do here at the library, but when Malka asks you to do this, you kind of just don't say no. So here I am, and I hope that I give justice to her piece. It's a little chapter from her upcoming memoir, and the chapter is called My Leonard. There is a few words here that I believe to be Hebrew, which I don't speak, so if I mispronounce, I do apologize. I'm just going to power through them, and you can just let me know after, at the end, how to say it correctly. Okay, my Leonard. He led me to his garden. I followed him to his shed. He looked more handsome than in any of his photos. So attractive, in fact, that with my first glance at him, my face burned as if I was just another of his overawed adolescent groupies. Make yourself comfortable, he said once we entered. His speaking voice was way more seductive in person than his singing voice, and so captivating, it left me with no mind to notice if I made myself comfortable on a chair or a bench or the coffee table. But I do remember fragrant candles scented in the air in the shed, their flames dancing in their gentle summer breeze. I assumed he had granted me the interview to promote his new album, New Skin, for the Old Ceremony, as well as his upcoming tour to Canada, the US, and Europe. And I was more glad to give it a huge plug on one of the most popular CBC radio programs broadcast across Canada. But I wanted the interview to do more, to offer an insight into the man beyond the irony, the artist beyond the ambiguities, and the mystery of his knife-edged paradoxes. Our cross purposes combined with, as Leonard would put it, the war between the man and the woman, sparked a lighthearted jousting in some parts of the interview and a lot of laughs. To my delight, he pulled back the curtains on Leonard Cohen, the man, as well as on his creative processes, which he liked to describe as a spiritual channel to the miraculous. But at a certain point, his hand shot under the wide hem of my skirt and up my thighs to regain his energy that was drained by my barrage of questions, so he maintained. He was approaching the age 40 that August of 1974, and his shirt was unbuttoned low enough to suggest virility. I was only a few years younger than him and quite experienced in most facets of the highs and lows of the artistic life, but this was the last thing I expected from anyone I interviewed, let alone Leonard Cohen. Caught off guard, I blushed and giggled nervously like a startled maiden. "Oh my God, Leonard, no, what's with you?" as I squirmed with my thighs free of his invading hand. But Leonard was sublimely brilliant in that interview, and I so treasured every word Leonard uttered in our interview that, right after it was recorded, I kept all the material in a bank safe. After a while, I forgot that I had placed it there. A few years later, I got a phone call from a friend who informed me that Leonard was depressed as hell because some of his notebooks containing the only draft of his poems had been stolen from his car, or with his car, when he left the vehicle for a moment to buy a pack of cigarettes. As soon as I heard this, I contacted Leonard and I told him I'd preserved some of those lost poems in a safe at my bank. "Where would you like me to carry the cassettes containing the poems?" I asked. He lived in California at the time. He told me it must be my karma to preserve those poems. Therefore, he wished me to keep them. Every few months, I remind him that I was still keeping his poems in my bank safe, and he'd say it was still my karma to keep them safe. The day he asked me to forward them to him, I couried them express. He included them on his album, Death of a Ladies' Man. A friendship developed between us after the interview was completed. Well, actually, our feeling of kinship was ignited on the night that he and I, the backup singers, riffed on his newly recorded song, Lover Come Back to Me, and around his kitchen table. And it continued for over 40 years. But I fell in love with Leonard Cohen long before I dreamed that I'd ever meet him in person to interview him, let alone call him a friend. It was a few years after I, as a teenage bride, flew for the first time away from the sensual heat of my hometown, Tel Aviv. I landed in Canada in the dead of winter. I had no idea how cold was until I deplaned in Montreal. My teeth clanked in shock as the cold froze every particle of moisture in my exposed skin, even the mucus in my nose, so it felt like the skin on my face would keep shrinking till it snapped apart. My tearful eyes misled me. I thought, when for the first time in my life I saw snow. It was not at all like the pristine, white, feathery, light loveliness I knew from the movies and books. In my first real-life encounter with snow, it was brown slush that turned my toes to icicles. But what iced the heart was exile. Nothing prepared me for that. Yes, exiling Jews had been practiced by world rulers and even by God for more than 2,000 years. And it was a major topic of study in my school, teachers' college, the youth movement, and at home as well. But in all these spheres, it was imparted and illuminated by the sublime poetry of the biblical prophets, the great 14th century poets like Yehuda Halevi, and in the 20th century by the likes of our national poet Chaim Nachum Bialik.
Yeah.
Thank you. And by the unique art of Chagall and Verdi's Nabucco as well. All had lent exile an element of divine beauty. And then one day, late in December 1961, terribly homesick, I went to the one place in Toronto that reminded me somewhat of home, Britnell's bookstore. Like the Bialik Library in my hometown, Tel Aviv, was beautifully appointed with floor-to-ceiling books, encased in rich wood, and even an elegant sliding ladder. As I walked in, I noticed a rather slim book titled The Spice Box of Earth, and right away I could almost smell the fragrance of cloves and myrtle twigs inside the ornate spice box that my father used at the Havdalah, the ritual that defines the boundaries between the holy Shabbat and the everyday. It was the only time in my life that I had purchased a book not for what's between the covers and not for the cover or its author, but for its title. Only after I opened the book and read a few poems did my eyes run over to the poet's name. They popped wide in astonishment that, when they found its author, Leonard Cohen was a Canadian poet. Canadian? Canada must be a much better place than I knew it to be if Leonard Cohen was born and raised in it, and they're writing such brilliant poems, courting God, woman, enticing him, her, to a dialogue with the seer poet. It didn't surprise me to find out that Leonard Cohen was celebrated in the Canadian media as the best young poet in English Canada. Some literary critics likened him to the romantic poet Lord Byron. But to me, he was more like the wise biblical poet King Solomon than the romantic Lord Byron. His spice box of earth was a modern song of songs. As in King Solomon's song of songs, in the spice box of earth, love is divine, ugliness is transformed into beauty, religion encompasses the sacred and the profane, the amorous and the social, the celestial sphere, as well as physical nature and the poetic spheres, all conveyed in a tone that contains an element of Bat-Kol, divine voice, and to me, those poems were like prayers, and prayers answered. They inspired me to sing the modern Hebrew songs that were composed with verses from the biblical songs of songs, as well as all the other songs I had loved back home. I believed it was due to the inspiration sparked by Leonard Cohen's poem that I became a singer, formed the singing duo Malka and Joso, and in years to come, Joso and I, our songs would be regarded as a major force in changing the perception of immigrants to Canada, illustrating that we were not aliens, but importers of vitality, hope, daring, ancient, and avant-garde sophistication, humor, and culture. 13 years after Leonard's The Spice Box of Earth inspired me to recover my voice, to speak and sing out for the voiceless, when Leonard first invited me to conduct my interview with him for the CBC. I was so awed and overwhelmed by his presence, my mind couldn't articulate what my heart was dying to convey to him, that I owed my career to him, and that, like all in my native land, I'll forever be grateful to him and admire his extraordinary, heroic service to my native Israel the years before. That service was recognized and highly lauded in Israel, especially by those who had witnessed it in person, 2 of my close friends among them. Yet strangely, it was one of the best kept secrets about Leonard Cohen in Canada. His son Tam, however, betrayed it in that summer in '74, when I first met him for the CBC interview. The sun had been baked so deep that it looked as though I had been just a week ago, and not nearly a year, since he had been exposed to the broiling sun of the Sinai desert and the bloody horror of Yom Kippur War. So many were killed in the '73 war, you couldn't see the water in the Suez Canal for the bodies floating there. But it's impossible to appreciate the full measure of Leonard Cohen's part without putting it in context. Briefly, in 1973, on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the holiest of the Jewish holy days, and the only day of the year when nearly all the Jews in the country are praying in their respective synagogues, the combined armies and air force of Egypt and Syria launched a surprise, powerful blitz attack on Israel. By the time the Israeli Jews rushed out of the prayer houses to take defensive action, the Arab armed forces had devastated most of Israel's air force and ground defense positions, as well as vital supply routes to civilians and the military alike. The Jewish state was on the verge of annihilation, yet now, of all times, as if determined to hammer the last nail into Israel's coffin, all the countries of the world, bar none, denied assistance to Israel in any form, not even the right to fly over the airspace to very vital medical supplies. It was at that moment, when echoes of the Holocaust reverberated all too loudly, that Leonard Cohen left his family and his work to lend a helping hand in Israel by working in a kibbutz, an agriculture commune. On his way, he was recognized by an Israeli singer who tried to persuade Leonard Cohen to join him and a few other musicians about to perform at an Air Force base. Listen, my songs are sad, Leonard said in response. It's going to be okay, the Israeli singer assured him, and so Cohen agreed. From that night, Leonard Cohen continued to attach himself to that small Air Force entertainment group as one of the few fellow singers recounted. In the morning, we performed to paratroopers who afterward boarded the planes, heading towards Suez. At evening time, they would return wounded or dead. There were not enough stretchers to carry the wounded when we performed in a hospital in Port Said. After they were flown to the Sinai Desert, Leonard and that small group of musicians were dropped into little places. Leonard told Zigzag UK, like a rocket site manned by 6 or 8 men, and they would shine their flashlights at the musicians, and they would sing a few songs. Or some officers would give us a jeep, and we would go down the roads towards the front, and whenever we saw a few soldiers waiting for a helicopter or something, we would sing a few songs. And according to Levi, one of the musicians, Leonard Cohen proceeded with us for 3 months, day after day, 4 to 5, and sometimes 8 or 10 performances a day, in a very difficult and dangerous conditions. It was physically and emotionally exhausting. We would sleep in sleeping bags on the ground, and Leonard, who didn't want to feel like a star, refused when I tried to arrange a place for him in the communal culture room. I didn't suffer enough. I didn't lose anyone I knew, Leonard Cohen told after that war, knowing that there was hardly an Israeli Jew who didn't suffer the loss of someone he or she knew and loved in that war. But the fact that Leonard Cohen, unlike almost everyone in the world outside Israel, risked his life to lend his support to the beleaguered Jewish state, told so much of Leonard Cohen, the man, especially to Israelis of my generation. I doubt there are people on this earth who love Leonard Cohen more than the Israelis of all ages do. Not only because of his visible support during the 73, of course, 73 war, of course. Leonard left everyone and everything to be in Israel during yet another war, the Lebanon War, or the Second Lebanon War, as it was called. When he met my mother in Tel Aviv, he believed her to be one of the Lamed Vav, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that correctly, Lamed Vav. The 36 humble, righteous people whose role in life is to make whole the shattered Shashina and God's world, and to justify the purpose of humankind in the eyes of God. None of the Lamed Vav knew that there are of the 36. I didn't expect to hear it from Leonard, even though we in our immediate family nicknamed my mother Tzedekis, a righteous one, for decades before Leonard met her. I hadn't mentioned this to him before he met my mother. Frankly, I was hesitant to invite him to my parents' apartment. It was a huge upgrade from my childhood home, but you could spin dizzy from the pattern of the wallpaper that covered every wall in the apartment, not to mention the clashing patterns of the equally lively upholstered sofas and chairs. Leonard preferred sparse, simple, almost monastic interior spaces, I knew. He was too sensitive for such lively stuff, I thought. He'd get a headache in that apartment, even if he wore sunglasses indoors. Still, I thought he'd like to meet my parents, a pair of fiery idealists of the generation that devoted their very being to the creation of the modern state of Israel and who were dying off all too fast now. Besides, I was staying at their place at the time, so I invited him over for a glass of wine. To my surprise, he didn't seem to notice the blinding wallpaper or upholstery or anything in that apartment. He was so taken by my mother from the moment he met her. She was in her 80s then, her knees worn out, and didn't speak English, and Leonard didn't speak Hebrew or Yiddish or Polish or German. Meet Leonard Cohen, one of the greatest poets of our era, the Leonard Cohen who sang for our beleaguered troops in the Yom Kippur War, I said to my mother in Hebrew. Seeing him through her eyes, I could barely stop myself from cracking up. She perceived him as she did the emaciated homeless refugee she sort of adopted when I was a child. With a slight motion of her hand, she urged him to follow her to the kitchen, a tiny space in which you had to walk sideways to get past the narrow table. From under that table, she pulled out one of the rickety, small stools. "Sit, sit," she told Leonard in Hebrew. Then she proceeded to heap on the narrowest of tables her sumptuous eggplant dish, stuffed zucchini, gefilte fish, gefilte fish, fricassee chicken, kasha, honey cake, and tea. All of which she tasted, even downing a glass of the lethal 777 brandy, that 777 brandy that she served him. "Drink it up, eat," she demanded. Not unlike him, whenever he invited me to his place for dinner, he'd empty his fridge and pantry to heap all he had onto his dinner table. "Thank you, but this is too much," Leonard protested in English. "He's not a good eater," I whispered to her in Hebrew. "You've got to eat," she told him in Hebrew. "You must eat. Your body is too thin. You've been starved. Your stomach shrank." She pulled out another stool for herself, sat by his side, and just stared at him. He stared back at her. They laughed. She nodded her head in approval when he started to eat. "Good, very good." She muttered, then left the apartment to take a bite out of the prostitutes who stationed themselves regularly on the sidewalk below her apartment building on Ben Yehuda Street, just north of Nordo Boulevard. After a few days of the same nothing more, Leonard told me, "I believe your mother is the lame Vav." And for once, his mouth didn't curl in that ironic twist I loved. What led him to perceive my mother in such a hollow light, I asked him. "She's one of the lame Vav," he replied. 2 years exactly before the day he died, Leonard sent me an email saying, "The old vehicle has sprung a few leaks. In and out of the shop these days." I knew he meant in and out of the hospital, but he'd get well sooner than later, I believed. Yet, another warning came in an email from him on July 22nd, 2015, hinting at personal and medical emergencies. But still, he made it to his keyboard. Still, he fought for beauty. "Full battle dress for now," he wrote. Leonard attached a photo in which it seemed he was receiving the same treatment as my sister had received in the last months of her life, so it gave me a hell of a jolt. Yet Leonard looked so dapper and elegant in that photo, even sporting a perfectly trimmed goatee and a jauntily angled hat. When you added his dark sunglasses, he looked like the super famous pop star out on the town. Leonard often signed his emails to me by his Hebrew name, Eliezer, which translated literally means, "My God provides help." I hoped that this war would prove true, and I clung to his promise that, when this was over, we'll have that drink. But when I turned on his last record and heard him sing Hanani, here I am, accompanied by the cantorial choir of the synagogue that his ancestors had founded in Montreal, and I knew he was declaring, Hanine, "I'm ready, my Lord." Even now that he is gone, Leonard is still, and always will be, a vibrant presence in my life. Even after his many beautiful parting songs, the notion that he would take his leave for real and forever from this earthly world at least remains unthinkable. The whole world grieved over him and eulogized him effusively. Scholars and non-scholars alike are sure to examine every word, comma, verse, and note of Leonard's compositions and attest to Leonard's sublime greatness in countless books. But to me, even though his writing changed my life, and I value his poems and songs as much as his most ardent fans, he was a most beloved friend of more than 40 years. A friend who, in our younger years, would invite me to have dinner with him in New York, and after a quick flight from Toronto, we'd be sipping wine together, laughing and laughing. A friend who offered me shelter at the most bizarre times of our lives. A friend who I believed was one of the 36 humble, righteous people whose role in life it is to collect the broken, shattered slivers of our world and justify the purpose of humankind in the eyes of God. Thank you, beloved Leonard, for illuminating the glint of hope in everything. I'll forever be grateful to destiny for bringing Leonard Cohen into my life. Leonard Cohen, the flesh and blood man, the most beautiful of humans, is lost to us now, but his wisdom and wonder, his questions and answers live on in his poems and songs, these prayers for us mortals to taste the divine. Like a bird on the wire, like a drunk in the midnight choir, I have tired in my way to be free. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Sarah. Well, last but certainly not least, I want to introduce to you Denise Donlan. I have to admit, as one of those awestruck teenagers who, you know, stalked Leonard, this is such an honor for me, because you were able in your career to really make sense of the cultural society we live in. Denise Donlan is one of Canada's most successful broadcasters and corporate leaders. She has been a co-host and producer of The New Music, director of programming and vice president general manager of Much Music City TV, president of Sony Music Canada, general manager and executive director of CBC English Radio, and co-producer and co-host of The Zoomer. She has also devoted herself to numerous charitable initiatives, working with organizations such as War Child Canada, Music Counts, and the Clinton-Justra Enterprise Partnership. She sits on a number of boards and has been honored with the Humanitarian Spirit Award and the Trailblazer Award at the Canadian Music Week. Woman of the Year from Canadian Women in Communications, Woman of Vision from Wired Women, and was inducted into the Broadcast Hall of Fame. She is a fellow of the Royal Conservatory of Music, another con artist, and a member of the Order of Canada. Her memoir, Fearless as Possible, was a finalist for the 2017 Kobo Emerging Writer Prize. Denise lives in Toronto with her husband Murray McLaughlin and their son Duncan. Please join me in giving her a very warm welcome.
Everybody okay? Got 10 more minutes in you? Yeah. Okay, you want to stretch? A little stretch before we're good? Chairs are a little bony. So thank you, honey. Thank you very much. I'm going to read from the book that was just mentioned. And the timing is tough. So exactly the day that it was announced that Leonard died, I was launching this book in the Distillery District with about 80 of my friends, wonderful people, Jack Rabinovich, dearly beloved, etc. It was a great night. It was full of a sort of bold-faced, bruise your toes, name-dropping kind of night. And it was going really well. It was not just a reading, it was songs, and people were performing and reenacting bits of the book, and it was lots of fun. And we got to the Leonard piece, and there's a picture of Leonard and I up there. I've known him for almost 40 years as an interviewer, as a broadcast executive, and then Leonard was signed to Sony Music Canada, so when I became the president of Sony Music, he was my artist, quote. So I was telling a funny story, and a friend of mine, who's a publisher, she said, I looked at the picture, and my phone had been going crazy and crazy and crazy. It was just beeping and beeping. And she said she finally reached out, because she didn't know why it was going so crazy, and got the news that Leonard had passed. So she didn't tell me, of course, until the end of the night, and we put away all the wine and the rest of the cheese and went outside and sat on a bench and sobbed. And so, yeah, it's already a year. It's amazing that it's already been a year. So Leonard, it's funny about hearing all these stories, because there's so many stories. There's a number of stories in the book. He would come into Much Music once when I was like literally 9 months pregnant, had no right to be on the air at that time. It was a youth station. It was a very bad illustration of what happens when you don't practice safe sex. Very scary. He came in, and so I had to interview him. And every time I interviewed Leonard, of course, you'd read everything and listen to everything, because, you know, he was a very loving man. He did not suffer fools, so you had to be on your game. And I was sitting there, sort of in my black shroud, trying to hide my condition, and he walks in with Irving Layton, and I'm like, oh my God. I did not study Irving. And I was like, how am I going to interview these two guys and give them both equal respect? When I'm like, what do I remember? High school, Leighton, I'm trying to remember. Anyway, they were both in a very silly mood, and at one point burst into song singing a duet of Yes, We Have No Banana to the 18-year-olds from coast to coast going, who the hell are those guys on the nation's music station? Anyway, so the story I'm going to read here is one of a couple. And when I started selling music, I was really looking forward to flying business class. Right? The music industry was full of, you know, high-powered industry and big parties, lots of money and huge rock stars. And little did I know that the moment I walked in the door, literally the bottom fell out of the industry. It was the time of Napster and illegal downloading and all of that. And instead of signing as many artists I want to, I actually laid more people off. It was not the most, it wasn't a cause and effect kind of thing. I think I mitigated it a little bit in Canada. But it was a tough time in the record business. And so I will read now. Oh, better put my glasses on. This is about an 8-minute story, and then I'll tell you what he thought of it after reading it. So, it was one thing to have to come out swinging, looking for wins in an embattled business, but it was something else when you had to go head-to-head with a beloved artist, like I had to do with Leonard Cohen. Compilation records, everybody remember compilation records? Yeah. They were a reliable profit center for most record companies before new digital technologies made music available in any combination a consumer might want. And this was an area I knew something about. At Chum, we made a lot of much music moolah with branded compilation series based on genres and shows like Much Dance and Extend-A-Mix and the blockbuster Big Shiny Tunes, which became the best-selling Canadian album series ever, selling more than 5 million copies. At Sony, our Creme de la Creme compilation series was called The Essentials. It had excellent brand integrity with well-curated collections like The Essential Tony Bennett, The Essential Michael Jackson, and now we wanted an Essentials from Leonard Cohen. Leonard already had a number of compilations released in different territories, including the 1975 The Best of Leonard Cohen, and my favorite, the 1980 German release. Any German speakers in the house? Okay, I'll do my best. Liebes Drame, Leonard Cohen singt seine schönsten Lieder, which, when I put it through an online translator, came up as Dear Dreams, Leonard Cohen sings his nicest songs. Leonard wasn't interested in working on another compilation. I pleaded, of course, he could remaster the tracks, fly to New York, remix anything he wanted. I promised the moon and stars, and he eventually, reluctantly, agreed. And we were generally aligned on what Leonard chose as his essential tracks. But when the final master arrived, So Long Marianne was missing. I called his manager, still Kelly Lynch at the time, and asked her why it was included. Surely this was an oversight. Leonard isn't so keen on that song, she said. Really? I can't believe it. It's one of his most beloved songs. He doesn't like it. And he won't change his mind, I've already tried. This was a problem. And it was a problem for not only the company, but for the world. When I sent the track listing without Marianne out to the international division, the reaction was predictable. Some countries were not even willing to release it without the song, fearing backlash from fans and critics. How can you call it an essentials record without one of the most essential songs? I began to wheedle and whine at Kelly. Soon Leonard was on the phone. His view was that the song, quote, was never as good in reality as it was in memory. I disagreed, but it's tough to argue with an artist about one of their songs. It's too subjective. It's like arguing about funny, right? That joke's funny. No, it isn't. End of argument. I suggested that his fans would be disappointed. He countered that his fans would understand. Leonard has a deep regard for his fans and often converses on fan sites directly. He would ask them himself, he said, and he did. It was a furious debate. Some fans sided with Leonard, against the evil record company, forcing him to do something he didn't want to do, while others agreed that an Essentials record without Marianne would be incomplete. He still wouldn't budge. I hated to bring up the point that at the time, most artist contracts don't stipulate that the artist's permission is required. But we were quickly running into manufacturing deadlines, and we needed that song. The next time we talked, I had no choice but to convey the message. Leonard, you know we can put it out without your blessing. That did it. The poet was pissed. I literally had to hold the phone away from my ear. It was a 20-minute rant. And he wasn't just angry at me. It was every publisher, every label executive, every corporate suit who profited from artistic work but disrespected the talent. True artists will go to wall for their work, and so they should. I was crushed, but I had to fight back. Leonard, I said, I have always respected your work. You know that. Even in the Much Music days when I used to interview you, I'd read everything you'd ever written, cherished every song you'd ever wrote. And it was true. I placed Leonard on an artistic pedestal so high, it had its own lighting. And cherubs. I hate to disappoint you, but I have no choice. There was a big silence. Leonard replied, Denise, if you insist on this course, if you insist on going against my wishes and including this song when I have asked you not to, then go ahead. But you need to know that you will forever hold a much smaller place in my heart. I know. I could barely breathe. Leonard, I said, I'm very sorry, but that's a risk I have to take. I put the phone down, totally shattered. At home, I sat around for hours, miserable. I may have had a glass of wine. Or a bottle. The next day I emailed Kelly to let her know that we would be including Marianne on the record. I described the call and told her how shaken I was. And later that afternoon, I got an email from Leonard. Dear Denise, your place in my heart is as secure as ever. That conversation was just business. I kind of enjoyed it. I rarely get a chance to argue with anyone, and I'm sorry if I hurt your feelings, and I sincerely apologize. I have to answer to my superiors just as you must answer to yours. Nothing really hangs on this issue. These are all very tiny matters and have no weight at all in the butcher shop we call the world. All that matters here is the heart, so let's keep ours open. Your old friend, Leo. I know. That's why I put this story in the book, because that apology email was like, it's a haiku. So the album came out with So Long Marianne and went on to sell gold or platinum in countries that included the Netherlands, Australia, Poland, and of course Canada. It always went #1, by the way, in Norway. Poetry, darkness, I don't know. And today, of course, this was written a year and a half ago, Leonard is selling out arena-sized crowds all over the world, adored on the scale he should be, and still singing So Long Marianne. So that's one of the Leonard stories. Another one that I was sort of crazy because it was really goofy. When I went to work for Sony, Leonard had been up on Mount Baldy for about 10 years, and he hadn't put a studio record out for 10 years. So the record company internationally, because as I said, he always sold well internationally, was very excited to get a new record, and he was coming with 10 new songs. I was the president of the Canadian company, and I was just learning the business. I had no idea how the record business operated at the same time that it was, people were running around with their hair on fire because it was falling apart. I got to fly to California to hear the record. So it was me and my business affairs manager. And we got to the hotel, and it was a tiny little hotel in Malibu. At times I was a very frugal record company manager. And we were supposed to meet around noon and then go to his studio where he recorded the record with Sharon Robinson and hear it like you do at a listening party with massive speakers and the best sound possible, and all that emotional stuff that comes with hearing a record for the first time with an artist that you love, because it's fraught. What if it's awful, right? It's a very emotional period. Anyway, he phones around noon and he says, we can't listen to the record today. Well, why not? Well, there's a bank holiday and he didn't have the keys to the studio. And I'm like, he said, what about tomorrow? And I said, well, I have to fly to Nevada tomorrow. Celine Dion was just starting her thing in Vegas, and of course you never mention another artist to an artist you're talking to. Do that. I said, well, I have to do it today. Is there any other? He said, I said, don't you have a reference copy of the CD? And he said, yes, I've got one here. He said, do you have a CD player? And I'm looking in this room, and it's a tiny room with literally one double bed, a chair, a bureau, and that was it in the room. And I look over and I said, oh yeah, there's a CD player. I said, hang on, let's see if it works. So I go over and it's literally it's an AM radio with a CD player stuck on top of it. I said, yes, I've got one, but it's probably going to sound pretty bad. And he said, well, that's the way most people listen to records when they hear them. Why don't we try that? Okay. I probably should have just phoned a studio and booked one and got it done, but frugal. So Leonard shows up, and he's dressed, despite the heat, in this hat, his natty is just perfect. And he walks in, and I present the 2 bottles of wine that I bought. They were Canadian wine, and I apologized for it because Canadian wine at the time was not as delicious as it is now. And he didn't like. He said, "It's okay, Denise. I'm a patriot." And I'd ordered a 10-pound cheese tray from the hotel restaurant. So we sat down, we're talking about Irving and Mordecai and going catching up, and it was all good. Of course, Leonard sits in a chair. My business fair guy is like leaning against the bureau. The only place for me is on the bed. So I'm on the bed. So I said, okay, you're half in the bag at this point. Maybe we should listen to the record. So he gives me the record. I go to put it in, and I hit play, and you can barely hear it because we're right on the water and the ambient white noise coming from the waves is just blocking it out. So we try our best, and he says, well, maybe if we move it closer. So I go over to the CD player, and I try to pick it up, and of course it's a great hotel. It's nailed to the side of the thing. He says, okay, well, maybe we should get closer. So we go over, and literally, here's the wall, here's the CD player, here's the bed. And we're trying to push the bed, that's nailed too. Right? So we sit down, Leonard, me, business affairs guy, with our feet underneath the bed and the CD player here, and listen, and it's beautiful. It's simple, it's beautiful, but around 4 songs in, I got the giggles, and he's looking at me like, what are you laughing about? And I'm like, Leonard, look. You're an internationally renowned artist, and this is a listening party for the first record you put out in 10 years, and we're half in the bag listening to it on a closing play. Like, no one could believe it. It was great. Anyway, he agreed to everything, because my job, of course, was to convince him to do a worldwide promo tour and go and tour around the world, and who did we get for the liner notes? We thought, ooh, the Dalai Lama or Bono or Mordecai. And we had huge plans. And he left, the little top of his hat, he kind of pirouetted down the hall. I got on a flight the next day, thrilled out of my head that I was going to deliver a fantastic package to the international market. And when I landed in Nevada, I got a call from Kelly who said, Leonard wanted to know that he's changed his mind. I'm like, on what? She says, on everything. I was like, oh. Anyway, we started from scratch. We got a great record. It sold its head off, and it was awesome. And we miss Leonard desperately, and I'm glad you're all here to carry his legacy forward forever and ever and ever. And we've got the music, and we've got the words, and we're sort of blessed to have sort of been breathing the same air for the time that we have. Thank you.
Well, a great evening for all of us here, I believe. are here for love of a wonderful man. So thank you for having this love in for Leonard together with the rest of us. A special thank you to Sarah, the Toronto Public Library, to John B. Lee, Denise Donlan, Malka Himel, and just please be safe tonight and warm, and hopefully we will see you in a year's time. Anyway, thank you.
So nice to meet you.
You too, John.